Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabarty. We are coming to you live on September 20th, Friday afternoon, and we are going to be reacting to the Thursday Night Football dismantling that the Jets put on the New England Patriots. An ugly game on primetime football. We are going to talk about the highs of the Jets as they played a near flawless game, and again, the sort of downfalls of the New England Patriots in a game that Patriots fans such as myself would love to forget, even though it was probably a sign of what is to come for New England. So we're going to be breaking down that game before moving on to the remainder of the action in week 3 of the NFL. We'll be talking about the biggest games with some of the key storylines and questions that are hopefully going to be answered this upcoming weekend. And then we are going to be continuing to do our top 5 bets against the spread this week. We're off to an excellent start so far this year. We're hoping to continue on with that trend. Then moving off of the NFL, some big time news across the world of sports with Shohei Ohtani putting together one of, if not the greatest individual performance I have ever seen across all sports last night, as he founded the 50-50 club with 50 home runs and 50 stolen bases. So history made. We're going to be diving into that. And then additionally in the NBA, the Philadelphia 76ers have signed superstar Joel Embiid to a max contract extension. We'll be breaking down some thoughts on that, whether or not it was the right decision, how this may age, and what chances the Philadelphia 76ers have to win the NBA Finals this year. So a whole lot to dive into in what was a very eventful 24 hours in sports. But before we do all of that, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. To any of our viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports as we try and make the show as interactive as possible. Helps us continue to grow the channel and get to know your guys' opinions on the latest happenings in sports, whether it is a quick comment or a thoughtful question. We want to hear what you have to say. And then if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can even use the super chat feature that is available on YouTube by clicking the $sign. If you leave a comment along with a tip or donation, your comment will pop up on screen. And then additionally, you can do so using the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be very greatly appreciated there. The New York Jets last night absolutely handed it to the New England Patriots, as it seems like this divisional rivalry that has been very one-sided over the past decade or so is now swinging the other direction. The Patriots had won 8 straight games in MetLife. The win streak overall was even that much longer until the Jets beat the Pats in what was an ugly game in Week 18. So that is 2 straight wins for the Jets over the Patriots. Again, as both of these franchises are in drastically different spots. And the number one takeaway of this game, of course, has to be the play of Aaron Rodgers, who really looked like himself once again fully. Now, obviously, this isn't MVP Aaron Rodgers necessarily that is controlling everything quite in the same way, but he was excellent in this game, 27 of 35, 281 yards and 2 touchdowns, and the biggest thing was that mobility was coming back some. He talked about it in his post-game interview that he himself is still sort of working back to sort of trust his body once again to make those plays rolling out of the pocket and getting upfield, and that's what he was able to do in this game. We talked yesterday about the fact that Geno Smith was able to have success against New England based off of his ability to move out of the pocket and hit players downfield, where off of those initial reads, the Patriots defense has looked pretty good, but then once you move the pocket, it feels like the defensive breakdowns start to pick up, and that's what Aaron Rodgers was able to do. He had a couple scrambles himself, 3 of them upfield for a total of 18 yards. That is a pretty substantial deal for the Jets, where again, Aaron Rodgers, it's all about the mental upside with him and his understanding of the game. But one of the biggest hesitations was the fact that up to this point, he really hadn't looked comfortable moving around in the pocket. And it seemed like he sort of put that to rest. Now, I'm sure it's not something that he is going to overly want to lean on, is using that mobility. But now it at least feels as if it is an option for New York, which is a huge deal. And we saw him as well sort of continuing to get more comfortable in this Jets offense. We saw week 1, it was only 2 actual wide receivers that caught passes for him. There's definitely, yes, still some, short-handedness and lack of depth in that receiver room. But you look at the fact that he was able to spread the ball out, hit 8 different players, 4 receptions in this game, including, I believe it was 4 wide receivers with Lazard, Mike Williams, Xavier Gibson, and of course, Garrett Wilson. So that is a huge deal as well, that he just seems a lot more comfortable in the entire environment. Tyler Conklin, their tight end, had a pretty big game as well, 93 yards. So this is overall a very encouraging performance for the Jets. We talked about this yesterday. It is also against the New England Patriots, so you do have to keep that in mind. But all things considered, I think Jets fans have to come away very pleased with this game as a whole. We talk about sort of Rodgers' ability to spread the ball out, the fact that he can at least be a little bit more mobile. There are now layers to this offense, and we saw this little bit of a 2-headed monster that is emerging in that running back room between Breece Hall and Braylon Allen. Now, Breece was dealing with a quad injury, I believe it was, during the Titans game last week. Short week, so that probably played some amount of a factor into the amount of carries that Braylon Allen was also getting. But 16 carries for Breece Hall, 11 carries for Allen. Like I mentioned, yes, Breece was probably given a slightly reduced role given the fact that he is dealing with some physical ailments, at least to some degree. But the other part of it is Braylon Allen is just making it impossible to not continue feeding him the rock, where he is averaging 5.6 yards per touch up to this point through 3 weeks. And from a pure rushing standpoint, he is outperforming Breece Hall inside of the tackles, which is not an indictment on Breece Hall because he's still an excellent running back, but it is also just the fact that they have maybe 2 different running backs with a little bit different flavors. Braylon Allen is a wrecking ball up the middle. I wouldn't say he doesn't have explosive plays to his game, because we saw that was clearly not the case based off of his performance against the Titans in week 2, but he can just get maybe a little bit more done in terms of, having that power back once it gets towards the goal line. Now, I know Breece Hall actually did rush for a touchdown last night and did a very good job of weaving through traffic and getting in there. So, again, it's not like complimenting Braylon Allen is any sort of a putting down Breece Hall, but it's just to say that they have 2 different options, and they are both pretty versatile, all things considered. So that is a huge plus as well. Overall, their offense was excellent in this game. If I were to point to 2 things that were red flags, number 1 would be the injury to starting right tackle Morgan Moses. He ended up leaving the game right at the end of the 3rd quarter. He ended up getting pushed back by Patriots defensive tackle Dietrich Wise, and then some bodies came in from behind and ultimately shook him up there. It's looking like a leg injury. We don't know exactly what the classification is at this point. We don't know the severity of it, but it does sound like it's not supposed to be season ending, which is great news for the Jets. Obviously, it's probably going to keep him out some time, but I don't think it looks like anything that should be majorly concerning in terms of super long term there, which is obviously good for them that they're eventually going to be able to get him back. But the fact that now their first round draft pick, Olu Fashanu, is going to get maybe a little bit more experience here is not the worst thing in the world, where Fashanu was one of the highest rated tackle prospects coming into the draft. He ends up falling to 11 after a couple other tackles. I mean, Joe Alt was also sort of, it seemed like it was 1A, 1B for a while, with Alt pulling away at the end there. JC Latham ended up going, I believe it was 7th overall. So ultimately, Fashanu ends up falling to the Jets, which is a great sign for them because they know that they are going to need a left tackle in the future. Tyron Smith at this point in his late 30s is not going to be the franchise left tackle. For whatever it's worth as well, Tyron Smith has missed a lot of time over the past handful of years. So there's a chance that as they go into a playoff hunt, they might need a little bit of extra depth. And Fashanu, the fact that he's going to be able to get some opportunities, especially against a pretty manageable schedule, is not the worst thing in the world. Again, as long as Moses is going to eventually come back, thoughts are out with him. I think he should be okay. But the other side would be the clock management still hasn't been great yet up to this point. Now, obviously, there are bigger issues at hand for the Jets, and they seem to be solving them. But some weird stuff going on. I thought that the clock management at the end of the first half was really poor from them. It was just weird. They played with no sense of urgency or tempo. They were very casual about it. To be fair, the Patriots aren't exactly a threatening offense on the other side of the ball, but they had weird usage of their timeouts. Again, they were just so casual getting up the field, and then they kind of burned all their timeouts in this one stretch where I thought, at least if you're going to play with this slow pace early on, maybe throw in a timeout earlier and then try and hold on to one. I think they used their last one with around 40 seconds left in the half, and then from there had to play a lot more conservative in terms of, taking shots. It was 24 seconds, actually, as I correct myself on the fly, of when they used their last timeout, but then they proceeded to run another 4 plays. And at that point, having no timeouts with 20 or so seconds left, it just sort of limits you in terms of how much further you can advance the ball. They end up getting into reasonable field goal range. Greg Zuerlein sets up for a 45-yard field goal, and he misses that one wide left. So a little bit of points left on the board there, but again, sort of picking at straws there. And then the other part of that conversation would be the fact that 3 times against the Titans last week, we saw this Jets offense sort of not doing a great job of working up against the play clock. And in this game, we saw that they were able to, they had to call timeouts twice last week to avoid delay of game penalties. They did a pretty good job for the most part, but coming out of that first drive in the second half, they did also have to burn a timeout there. So just something, again, maybe a little nitpicky, but something that I noticed and maybe a little bit of a trend there. But we're going to briefly run through the Patriots side of this game because it was a total disaster. The reality of the situation is that was probably the team that I at least had in my expectations going into the year. They just overperformed in those first 2 weeks, and that's not to say that they can't eventually bounce back here. The Jets would have, as many excuses as anybody in terms of playing on this short week, their third game in 11 days. But the Patriots as well, a young team, go to overtime on Sunday, having this short week. It was very emotional then. Again, maybe I'm just making excuses here, but it did feel like a little bit of a letdown spot. I thought the Patriots were going to cover. That's what I predicted yesterday, but that line was so fishy, I should have been scared off there. But obviously now there are a lot of Patriots fans that, both sides of the ball. The entire team was really bad in this game. You can talk about the defense, which allowed, 100 extra yards after missed tackles. That was a stat that Amazon Prime showed at one point, one of those next generation stats. The entire team stunk. But now there are Patriots fans that are calling for Drake Maye, who did get to play in his NFL debut in the fourth quarter. Nothing spectacular. He was 4 of 8 with 22 yards. He had a couple carries, one of them going for 11 yards. So he got the Patriots into the red zone. I believe it was fully into the red zone. We'll double check here, but that was the closest. Yeah, it was down to the Jets 7. That was the closest that New England had gotten all game to the red zone, to the end zone, I should say. So, there is that going for them. It was against backups. I thought Maye looked good, not great. Did almost throw an interception on his first play. He was sacked a couple times. One of them was a little bit more on his fault. But again, that idea of taking hits is why I still stand by the fact that the Patriots should not rush to start Drake Maye. You look at that offensive line, it was a disaster all game long. Ultimately, the Jets recorded 7 sacks in this game. And I'm not jumping to sort of ruin the developmental track. And again, maybe it's slightly cowardly, but I think it's more responsible than anything, especially given the hardships we're seeing with a lot of these young quarterbacks in the NFL today, that the Patriots are being a little bit more cautious. And it sounds like Drake Maye is still sticking with Jacoby Brissett going forward, who did have a pretty rough game, just 98 yards passing. But I also, outside of a throw to Austin Hooper that he was off on in the second quarter, I don't know how much there really was for him to do there. Got nothing from the run game. Ramondre Stevenson, just 23 yards. A bad performance there. Again, not that it's totally his fault. Opposing defenses are going to continue to go all out against the run until the Patriots can show that they have any sort of a passing attack to, be scared of, or at least any form threatened by. The Pats had, one drive with Brissett where they were able to get down to the 23-yard line, and then the offensive line showed its head, picking up 3 consecutive holding penalties and allowing a sack. So that Patriots team is just a mess, is the reality of the situation. We can go into it a bit further, but all of my thoughts on it from yesterday in terms of this idea of needing to have some patience because this overall New England roster is such a mess, I still stand by everything I said there. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. Again, messy game there. Encouraging for the Jets. We're going to, of course, need to see them do it, against heightened competition in the coming weeks. But they have the Broncos and the Vikings in 2 consecutive games. Vikings game in London, so maybe a little bit of a weird one there. And then they are at home against the Bills. And that is sort of where we're looking at that true test kicking in. So we'll see about that. But as for now, Jets fans, enjoy this one. I'm sure it feels good to beat up on the Patriots after all of these years, but let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. But we're now going to be moving on to the remainder of the Week 3 NFL slate, and I want to talk about some of the key storylines of the biggest games of the weekend. Feels like overall a pretty good set of matchups that could tell us a lot of answers to some of these questions that we've been having over the first couple weeks. So I want to dive into all of that. But before we do so, going to take a quick break here. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world gone? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world gone? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't replaced all this my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we just wrapped up talking about the Thursday night football game, which was not a good one in terms of an entertainment standpoint. I'm sure Jets fans everywhere love that game in particular, but ultimately very non-competitive. That being said, I think that this upcoming weekend and some of the Sunday games in particular are going to be much more entertaining and have the potential to answer a lot of questions that we've had up to this point in the NFL based off of what has been a very interesting first couple weeks of the 2024 NFL season. So I want to dive into some of these matchups and talk about really what's at stake for a lot of these biggest games. And I want to start in Minnesota, where they will be hosting the Houston Texans during the 1 o'clock p.m. slate. And the biggest question here is this Sam Darnold thing. Obviously, we're seeing the resurgence of a number of quarterbacks that were counted out over the past couple weeks, and we're trying to find out how sustainable is all of this. And Sam Darnold, obviously, not alone. Again, multiple quarterbacks that are, playing much above expectations up to this point, and I do think that Darnold, especially in that Kevin O'Connell system, where I think that O'Connell gets so underrated in terms of the love that he gets from the casual NFL fan. I think that he is an excellent coach and an excellent offensive scheme person, that he is helping Sam Darnold to have the 5th best passer rating in the NFL up to this point. Now, sure, you can point to that Giants game, say, well, that's really when he did a lot of his heavy lifting, and it's against the Giants defense. Sam Darnold, I think he was good, all things considered, against San Francisco, but we did see a little bit more, at least, of kind of the Darnold that we have known for the longest time in terms of some of the decision-making, the sacks that he took, but he ended up getting the win. And he made the throw, of course, to Justin Jefferson down the field. That was very impressive as well. So how real is this revenge tour for Darnold? He now gets to go up against the Texans, which is a very physical defense. We saw that this past weekend in Chicago. Now, what we also learned from that Sunday night football game between Houston and Chicago was that if DeMeco Ryans doesn't think that you are excellent in terms of facing the pressure, he's going to bring it. It's not necessarily his MO, but if he's not going to trust you to actually burn you downfield, he might bring that pressure a little bit more. Now, the fact that the Vikings also have Justin Jefferson probably builds into that, and I don't know quite how much pressure they're going to bring, but I do think that it's going to be very interesting to see. And Jefferson is expected to play, by the way, at least as of the time recording here. Was dealing with a quad contusion last week, but he seems like he is good to go in that game. And I think it's going to be really interesting for Sam Darnold in this one. And then, just talked about the idea of bringing pressure. One of the biggest winners of the first couple weeks has been Brian Flores, the Vikings defensive coordinator. This idea that obviously, the very public downfall, or however you want to phrase it, the relationship that he had with Tua Tagovailoa when he was in Miami was not a good look for him, but ultimately, he is a very high quality coach, and it's more so on the defensive side of the ball. There's still a lot of unknowns in terms of will that actually be able to translate to him being a head coach, because the leadership didn't seem all too great in his first go-around with Miami a few years ago. But even that being said, they still made the playoffs. They were not a bad team under his leadership there. So I think that Flores is somebody who understands that this is a big season for him now that he has these new pieces on the defensive side of the ball in Andrew Van Ginkel and Jonathan Grenard and those types of additions. So that's a game that I definitely think is going to be very interesting to keep an eye on. Of course, Eagles at New Orleans is a huge game. More so than anything, it's just about, we talked about Sam Darnold just now. Derek Carr on the other side, he has been incredible up to this point as the Saints offense has put up over 40 points in each of their first 2 games. Now, can't imagine that that's going to be the expectation for them moving forward, but still, how legitimate is this Saints offense, where I still think that Philadelphia, I've been saying this for weeks now, that is a defense you can move the ball against. So it's not like this is a grade A test of going up against an elite defense, but a lot of playmakers on that Philly defense. And for the Saints, again, you're not going to score 40 points per game, but now that they have all of these, expectations and all of these articles and media people talking about how great Derek Carr has been and just the extent of this New Orleans offense making them a potential contender, can they continue to back that up? Because again, while I don't think that the Eagles are an elite defense, they still have a lot of players. And ultimately, now that the spotlight is on the Saints, week 1, they ended up beating up on the Panthers. Just about everybody seems to be doing that. So, a little bit less to take out of that game. But now against, back-to-back teams that are supposed to be some of the best in the NFC, can you continue to produce? That is the main thing. On the Eagles side of this, it's just about how you respond, and it's definitely on Nick Sirianni. We talked about this last week. Spotlight is going to be on him moving forward here, where I don't know quite how much necessarily, you can give as to what does Sirianni have to prove on a week-to-week basis. It's just about sort of how these games unfold, and will he continue to, or will he be able to make the right adaptations and the right calls? We'll have to see there, but obviously a big bounce back spot for the Eagles, and they really need it given their loss on Monday night. Then, if you look a little bit into the later slate, Baltimore at Dallas, a very interesting game there. 2 teams that suffered disappointing losses for different reasons. Saints are a better team than the Raiders, but the Cowboys getting blown out by the Saints last week was a huge red flag for them, especially considering the fact that, last year they were such a dominant team while playing at home in Jerry World, and then to get rolled up on like that by the Saints, huge red flag there. On the Ravens side, seemed like they had so many chances to close out that game against the Raiders, weren't able to do so. Their secondary ended up having a pretty tough time overall trying to stop Gardner Minshew. What's it going to look like here against a more competent, no disrespect to Gardner Minshew, but, more of a highly regarded quarterback in the NFL in someone like Dak Prescott. Dak himself also has a lot of pressure surrounding him after what was a largely underwhelming performance in week 2. So both of those teams trying to bounce back from losses. Somebody's got to lose that game. And I think that you're looking at a situation here where Ravens, they'd be falling to 0-3, which still a talented team. I don't want to call it a death sentence if they go 0-3, but that is a huge uphill battle to be able to climb your way back into, winning your division, having home field advantage for the playoffs, so massively important there. Cowboys maybe a little bit more wiggle room, especially because their top competitor in the NFC East is the Eagles, who also have a tough, game ahead of them. So I think that we're going to be diving a little bit more specifically into that game when we do our best bets of the week, but very interesting game there. Can Baltimore's secondary recover after getting carved up by Gardner Minshew? Can the Cowboys find a way to get any semblance of defense back and running? Because week 1, they were playing against the Cleveland Browns, who, their offense obviously has their own dysfunctions. This is easily the biggest test that they have had up to this point in terms of strength of the opposing offense that they are going to face. And then Detroit at Arizona, another very interesting game. I've been very high on the Cardinals entering this season. Last week, they put a thumping on the Los Angeles Rams. This is a team that, they're going to be going toe-to-toe with the Detroit Lions both of them two hard-nosed football teams. Yeah, Kyler has all the magic, of course, when in terms of running around in the pocket, making plays happen there, but I do think that the strength of these teams are both in the run game, and this is a situation where Arizona, if they are going to prove to be a contender of any sorts in the NFC this season, their defense has to step up for them. Not that they didn't last week, but obviously dealing with so many injuries the Rams were last week on both the wide receiver front and on the offensive line. Now they're going to be coming into a game against a hungry Detroit Lions team that I think is going to try and reestablish the run. Let's see whether or not they are able to hold up there. And then the Lions as well, like I mentioned, I think that they're going to try and reestablish the run, but we have seen this offense that was one of the best in the league last season really struggling out of the gates. Can Jared Goff respond, and that offense as a whole? What is their approach going to be? Are they going to go back to the, pound the ground running game type of style, or are they going to keep trying to air things out as Ben Johnson is sort of trying to audition to some degree for a head coaching spot next year? And then Sunday night game, the Kansas City Chiefs at the Atlanta Falcons. Very weird game. Chiefs, how are they going to look without Isaiah Pacheco? Pacheco going to be out for, sounds like, at least 6 weeks, if not more. Andy Reid even opened up a little bit on the possibility, and it was a very vague answer, so I don't want to read too much into it. But he talked about the chances that, Pacheco could be out for the entire season. Now, I would be a little bit surprised if that were to happen, but a broken fibula is a huge deal. So how will the Chiefs be able to make up for that ground game? We'll see there. And then for the Falcons, was last week a fluke of the Eagles just sort of throwing up on themselves on that final drive? Or can the Falcons actually be one of these teams that competes week in and week out? We will have to see there, and they will have, a very tough matchup, of course, against the Chiefs, who are going through their own issues, like I just mentioned, with the running game. But that being said, hard to find a power rankings list across the NFL that doesn't have the Chiefs at number one. But we'll get a little bit more into the Monday night games on Monday during the preview. I do think the Jaguars also have a lot to prove there, and the Bills need to see if they can continue to overcome all of the losses on defense. Terrell Bernard now expected to be out for a while. So, a lot going on in that Buffalo side of the ball as well, and that should also be a very interesting game. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section on this week 3 slate, what you are most looking forward to. But we are going to be now next shifting gears and talking about our best bets of the week. We have been off to a great start so far through 2 weeks, but this is a very difficult slate to pick out, so we're going to be giving you the top 5 plays against the spread this upcoming weekend. But before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are going to be looking ahead to this upcoming weekend in the NFL and giving our 5 picks against the spread through 2 weeks, we have done a pretty good job, all things considered, going 4-1 in back-to-back weeks, hoping to get that undefeated stretch there, but I think that this is a pretty tough weekend in terms of sort of weeding out which games are a little bit trappish, and we're going to be walking a fine line here, but we're going to try and, continue on the positive stretch here and continue to add to that positive record. So without further ado, getting into the picks here, my number one bet of the weekend is the Ravens -1 on the road against the Dallas Cowboys. This is a very interesting matchup between two of the, Super Bowl contenders headed into this season. I myself am a lot lower on the Cowboys, and I have been headed into this season. I don't have them as a playoff team, and this is a situation where, as much as they need to bounce back, the Ravens are currently 0-2 and can't really afford to fall into a hole in that AFC North that is obviously ultra competitive. And neither one of these teams looked all that great this past weekend. The fact that Gardner Minshew was able to carve up Baltimore's secondary last week is a concern. Now, still not sure about the status of rookie cornerback Nate Wiggins, that he will be an important part to this for Baltimore. But ultimately, when I look at this game, I think that the Ravens are going to be able to put up points against the Cowboys. I'm not sure if Dallas is going to have any chance to really survive against what is an excellent Baltimore front seven. I think that this is already a Cowboys team that I think is very lackluster on the offensive line, has struggled to really get much out of their running game up to this point. Last week, the Ravens completely shut down the Raiders' rushing attack. Not that, that either is necessarily an elite group, but I think they are going to... This is a desperation game to some degree for the Ravens, where the Cowboys, they do have a little bit more wiggle room. The Eagles, who are their top competition in the NFC East, also have a difficult matchup against the Saints that we are also going to be previewing here. But this is a spot where I think that Baltimore's defense is going to show out once again, and I think that they're just going to be able to get themselves out to a lead and run it out from there. Now, you can say to me that that's what they should have done last week against the Raiders, and they were unable to close the door there. But again, I just feel like this is a team that has really good coaching under John Harbaugh. A lot of losses on that defensive side of the ball. Mike Macdonald leaving may have shown a little bit more flaws on that defensive side for the Ravens, but I think that this is essentially a pick'em game, and I cannot see the Ravens going down 0-3 up to this point in the season. I think that they are in need of a wake-up call, and I do think that they will bounce back this week against the Cowboys. I have the Lions going into Arizona and covering -3. I've been very vocal about the fact that I am a believer in this Cardinals team, and I did pick them to make the playoffs, but this is a situation where the Lions, while they're still 1-1 and they're not in any sort of a bad position, their offense has been massively underwhelming up to this point in the season, and I think that in order to get back on track, what they are going to do is get back to sort of their roots, what made them so excellent last year, which was running the ball. That's sort of that hard-nosed Dan Campbell strategy. They have one of, if not the best offensive line in the NFL, and I think it's just going to be too much for the Cardinals to handle in this game. Now, it's a spread of 3. I think it's going to be close, and this could be a game that ends up nearing that push category there, but I think that ultimately the Cardinals defense, as much as I like Zach Gannon, I continue to sing his praises, that I think he's a great head coach and I think he's a great defensive mind. I just don't think that the personnel is going to be able to match up man-to-man with what the Lions can provide for you up front. You establish that game up up front initially. And then from there, once you get that going, Jared Goff is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL at operating out of play action. So I think that that's something that they can capitalize on. I will say Lions secondary hasn't necessarily taken the steps that I was hoping to see headed into this season, but at least they have, elite production right now from that front seven. Aiden Hutchinson on an absolute tear through 2 weeks. If you were to pick a defensive player of the year based off of 2 weeks, would probably go to Hutchinson. That's of course not how these awards go, and it's a little bit unfair to say that, but I think that talent for talent, this is going to be a game where the Cardinals, who are going to be frisky this year and are going to make things interesting continuously, they're coming off of what is just a beatdown against the Rams. They're feeling good about themselves, while the Lions, that Dan Campbell is going to have them ready to make a statement, and that's what I think they're going to do on the road in Arizona this upcoming weekend. The Chargers on the road against the Pittsburgh Steelers. This is another very short line. I believe it moved a little bit in favor of the Chargers. I think this might have opened at 2.5 points if I'm not mistaken. Another very close game here, but I think that the Steelers, I don't view them necessarily as the talent of a 3-0 team, but what I do know is that defense is capable of being a 3-0 worthy unit, and I think they're going to cause problems for the Chargers. The Chargers are off to a good start, being 2-0, but they have beaten the Raiders and the Panthers up to this point. Jim Harbaugh is an excellent coach, and he is already proving to be a difference maker for this Chargers team. But ultimately, when I look at the Steelers, I think this is a situation where they are going to take the running game away from the Chargers, and then at that point, it is up to Justin Herbert, who was on the injury report earlier this week, is clearly dealing with that foot issue stemming back to training camp. And I just don't think that the Chargers have the playmakers on the perimeter to be able to make the Steelers pay in this situation. I think that the Steelers are going to come in, try and muck things up on the ground. And listen, I'm not the biggest fan necessarily of that offense either. You're looking at 1 touchdown scored, I believe, between 2 weeks for the Steelers en route to being 2-0. It's not like they are going to lay it on you, but I think if the Steelers get out to a hot start here, this is another situation where I think that they are just going to be able to bleed some more clock and take away the strength of this Chargers team, which is the run, force them into a little bit more of a passing-friendly game, and I'm not sure. I think that this is a game where the Steelers, we picked them last week against the Broncos. Was it pretty? Absolutely not, but I think that they get the job done once again. Preface this a little bit earlier. The Eagles on the road in New Orleans playing in the Superdome. I always have a very tough time sort of betting on a team that is riding high, playing against a team that it feels like everybody is now out on. And that's the situation at hand here for the Eagles and the Saints. Saints have looked almost flawless through 2 weeks. Meanwhile, the Eagles are coming off of what was a national embarrassment on Monday Night Football against the Falcons, where they gave that one away. But the reality is, I think that the Eagles have a pretty glaring weakness, and that's on the defensive side of the ball. I think you can run on them. And what we saw is Alvin Kamara still has it. And what happens there as well is the fact, and we talked about this with Jared Goff in the preview of that Cardinals game, where I think that the Saints will be able to establish the run once again, and then is when you sort of get the threat of Derek Carr and that deep ball. They have somebody like Rashid Shaheed that makes opposing defenses just stuck in this middle ground where you want to step up and help in the run game, but also when you have somebody who can stretch the field. Derek Carr has hit Shaheed on deep bombs in each of the past 2 weeks that it's either way a little bit of a lose-lose for you there. And I just think that this is going to be a situation. I understand the line, I think, moved a solid 4 points from week 1 to week 2, where I believe when this first opened a week out, it was the Eagles being favored by -2.5. So, again, I don't love necessarily riding with the momentum in that type of sense. I feel like you can set yourself up for some traps, but this is a situation where I think the Saints have a strength that can go directly against Philadelphia's weakness of that run game. And I think that this is going to be an opportunity where the Saints offense is going to be able to shine once again. So I'm taking them -2.5. And then game 5 here, we did excellent last week through the first 4. That 5th game is always where things get a little bit sketchy. We had the Jaguars against the Browns last week. That's what failed us. This is another gross game to bet on, and it is the Chicago Bears on the road against Indianapolis. Now, as we were live recording this show, I just checked during the break, and it is official that Keenan Allen has been ruled out for this game. That's not a great sign for the Bears, as I'm going to now sit here and try and convince you to take them. But this is more so than anything just about the fact that I am such a believer in that Bears defense. I think that they're one of the elites in the league. What they did against Houston last week should have been a statement that everybody should now be aware of. And this is a situation where Anthony Richardson, while we can all understand that the ceiling is 100% there and the physical gifts are very prevalent, I think that the decision-making and the inaccuracy is going to come back to hurt him. You have an excellent secondary there in Chicago that I think can throw out a bunch of different looks that are going to confuse the Colts. There was a clip of Jalen Johnson explaining sort of the misdirection in the secondary that he had when he was on a podcast with Richard Sherman. So I think that this is a group that's just going to be able to cause fits for that Colts offense. I think that, last week we saw Indianapolis run for something like 130, 150 yards, something along those lines against the Packers and still only put up 3 points. Now, on the other end, Caleb Williams and this Bears offense has not been able to make its mark yet up to this point. Like I just mentioned, Keenan Allen is ruled out, so that does hurt. But I think on the other side as well, we're still waiting on the full injury report for Indianapolis, but they are going to be without DeForest Buckner. The Colts defense are their number 1 pass rusher. Their rookie defensive end, Liatu Latu, is questionable for this game, so that is going to be crucial to keep an eye on. That last week, we saw Caleb Williams sort of running for his life. Now, Indy is a pretty good defense from a roster perspective. They still have a couple guys on that front line that can cause you problems. Grover Stewart specifically, along with Kwity Paye, that this is no slouch of a Colts defense, even if they are without Buckner and Latu. But I think that ultimately here, it's probably going to be a low-scoring game, and I think I'm just sort of riding with the best unit in this group, and that is the Chicago Bears defense. And, yes, Jonathan Taylor is great. He even acknowledged himself this past weekend that, he has a lot of room to grow in the passing game. I think that they're a little bit one-dimensional. Obviously, they do still have the deep ball, which is, a very scary thing as well. So it's not like you can entirely sell out to stopping that run game. I just feel like they're going to be able to sort of coax Anthony Richardson into making some poor decisions. And again, we're talking about the 5th pick here. Might get a little bit grimy and gritty, but I do think that the Bears are going to be able to pull this one out. So those are the 5. Just to sort of recap again, starting from top to bottom, we have the Ravens over the Cowboys on the road. The Lions covering -3 against the Cardinals. Another game on the road there. The Steelers covering at home against the Chargers to go 3-0, covering -1.5 there. The Saints continuing to roll, covering that -2.5 against Philadelphia, and the Bears, essentially winning outright as +1 underdogs up to this point. But let me know what your opinions are on this upcoming week in the NFL. I think that we have a ton of very interesting games in store for us, so should be very exciting. But we are going to be switching gears here now and diving into what was an even bigger story than anything we got out of the NFL last night, and that is Shohei Ohtani making history, becoming the first player to ever hit 50 home runs and steal 50 bases in a single season. So we are going to be diving into this incredible mark for Ohtani and talking some big picture legacy stuff here as well for him. So we're going to be diving into all of that. But before we do so, we do have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are now going to be diving into what was one of the most remarkable individual feats that we have seen in recent history, and that is, of course, the man, the myth, the legend, Shohei Ohtani, who last night became the first player in MLB history to record 50 home runs and 50 stolen bases in a single season. It was just less than a month ago that we saw him reach that 40-40 mark, became the sixth player in MLB history to do so then. And when he did so, it came on a walk-off home run, and it was an excellent moment, but there was a part of me that, was a little bit nervous in terms of the fact that I don't think it was going to be possible for Ohtani to be able to sort of top that moment for when he does inevitably reach 50-50. And he just showed that you cannot put limitations on what this man can do in the diamond. Last night, the Dodgers dismantled the Marlins in a 20-4 ball game, and Ohtani reached the clip with an all-time performance. He went 6 for 6, had 3 home runs, 2 doubles, a single, 10 RBIs, and 2 stolen bases to reach the mark. So now I believe officially he is at 51-51, so he is obviously not done yet. He almost had a cycle in this game as well, where he had, like I mentioned, a couple doubles. He did end up getting thrown out trying to stretch one of those into a triple, so it could have been that much more. But either way, even still, he becomes the first player in MLB history with the 50-50 in a season, but he also was the first player in a single game in MLB history with 3 home runs and 2 stolen bases. So a little bit of a microcosm of just how special this guy is. And I do think that, a little bit of an underrated storyline coming out of this was the approach from Marlins manager Skip Shoemaker, where it was, I guess to some degree there might have been fans out there was saying, well, why would you even pitch to Ohtani in that type of a situation? There was a pretty clear video of him in the Marlins dugout talking to somebody who seemed to have suggested the idea of walking Ohtani. This was coming in the 7th, right before he hit that home run number 50, and the lip reading experts out there caught him in this idea of walking Ohtani, saying, F that, too much respect for this guy for that blank to happen in terms of walking him, which I think is ultimately, something that we as fans should all root for. He talked about it being bad baseball karma to sort of take that away from him. He said out of respect for the game, he wanted to, actually test him and not, again, sort of wimp out of that. The Marlins, obviously, for months now have been very clearly out of the playoff picture. So I thought that was sort of a classy move from Shoemaker and the Marlins to not do so. But, He now, after this season, probably has a good chance to get himself paid by another organization, one that is a little bit more win now ready than the Marlins are. And he led the Marlins to the playoffs last year, so it's not like, he has no idea what he's doing. That was a team that, by many people's projections, were not making the playoffs last year, and ultimately they did. Ended up getting swept in the wild card round, but all things considered, I think that Shoemaker has a good future in front of him in terms of being a manager in the MLB. But of course, as for Ohtani, he is so clearly locked up. The MVP award, of course, will become the first ever designated hitter to win the MVP award, and he is, just like I mentioned, if you ever try and put a ceiling on him, he is just going to burst through it. And this is a regular season for the ages, history in a number of different ways. And I mean, the Dodgers have a chance to make it that much more special moving on here, where obviously year in, year out, they are expected to be one of the best teams in the MLB, and they have a real shot to sort of capitalize on a postseason run. Now, they have at least now clinched a playoff berth. Don't have the division locked up just yet, because the Padres, who have been on a great tear this second half of the season, are making things interesting as well. But either way, the Dodgers are going to be in the dance, and this time it's just about sort of fully coming through there. One of the bigger concerns with the Dodgers is the idea of, will their pitching staff be able to stay healthy? Now, Ohtani could have something to say in that as well. There are at least rumblings about the idea that he could potentially pitch in the postseason. I'm probably a little bit more skeptical there. Now, desperate times call for desperate measures, and last year we saw the Dodgers pitching staff end up just really falling apart on them due to injuries and suspensions alike. So, the Dodgers would probably like to avoid having to force Ohtani onto the mound, pitching for the first time in about a year. But like I mentioned, desperate times call for desperate measures. And overall here, just with Ohtani, I'm so glad that we get to see him now on a competitive team. As much as, no disrespect to the Angels, because they had chances at least to sort of capitalize on the situation with, I know that Trout obviously dealing with injuries in his own right, but with two of the best players in the MLB, they just weren't ever really able to put together a true contender. And there was only so long, I feel like, that the MLB and, media companies would be able to continue to promote Ohtani, and I think that they've done a great job overall with the PR of marketing him, but it's a lot harder for, I think, casual fans that aren't necessarily quite as in tune with baseball, especially when you're coming from a sport like basketball or the NFL to some degree of, oh, well, if he's so great, why aren't they winning? For some reason, that's a mental block that a lot of, non-diehard baseball fans can really wrap their heads around. Well, how great can they be if they are on a team that doesn't make the playoffs? Now, no longer that is an issue, as Ohtani has been able to take center stage. And, when they give him a $700 million contract, you think about, well, how could anybody possibly be worth that much money? And Ohtani is doing just about everything physically possible to show that there are cases where that is not a bad investment. Is it still a ton of money? Yeah, sure, but the money's got to go somewhere, and it's got to go to some players, and if any player is deserving of it, it has to be Ohtani. And this is a situation where I just feel like Ohtani, I don't know if we're ever going to, at least myself being 23 years old, I don't know if I'm ever going to see another baseball player better than what Ohtani is able to do. The fact that he is already one of the greatest hitters of all time. Of course, getting a 50-50 season is just unheard of. And on top of that, the fact that he is still, when fully healthy, a Cy Young caliber pitcher, it is just ridiculous that when you're talking about baseball Mount Rushmore And, recency bias is a very real thing. And I also don't want to be ignorant here, considering the fact that it's not like I've watched, a century of baseball like other people may have. But I think it is going to be so hard to not just include Ohtani off of the Mount Rushmore of the MLB, but I think that he's, marking his way towards being one of the greatest athletes of all time. And, being able to combine the two very differing aspects of the MLB and just rolling them into one player. I mean, it's a creative player type performance that he's been able to put out there. And like I mentioned, I'm just so glad that now he is able to, get all of the spotlight. Think about the fact that this is the first time that Ohtani has really been able to fully focus on his hitting. He's been a pitcher for so long as well that you talk about, maybe, there isn't quite as much value there, but it's the fact that now he doesn't have to worry about working on the fundamentals with his pitching and stuff like that. He can just sort of lock himself into hitting, and this is the level of production you get. It's just sort of, the thing of dreams for any front office in the MLB. And the Dodgers are very, very lucky to have him. I'm sure that they know that. But, when you talk about the idea of are there any other players in the MLB that could go 50-50, I can't really think of anybody who's going to get to that level of production. I mean, we're talking about a once-in-a-lifetime, at least, up to what we know up to this point. I do think that a lot of the time sports can be exponential, that once you open the door for knowing that something's a possibility, that others can follow sort of in those footsteps, that it would be, wrong of me to say that it's impossible that this is never going to happen, but I just have an extremely hard time really getting there with any of the current stars in the MLB, where ultimately, you look at some of the stars that are in the league right now. Bobby Witt Jr., he's gone 30-30 for each of the past couple seasons. Is he ever going to add the power to be able to hit 50 home runs in a season while also playing shortstop and having to, be on the top of his game defensively? Like I just mentioned, I think that it was beneficial to Ohtani, the hitter, that he wasn't able to pitch this season, and he was be able to sort of perfect his craft there. That I think, it's just so difficult, this idea of being able to. Ohtani also benefits from the fact that, he's not pitching this year. He doesn't have a defensive position. So that's sort of all he has to focus on. Witt, for as much as I love the player, and I think he's going to continue to have an excellent future in the MLB, there's so much more to his game as well at that defensive shortstop position that he's going to have to be on top of. You look at Ronald Acuna last year, who had one of the most impressive seasons in history. I think it went down as 40-70. I might be slightly overestimating on the home run total, but I don't think I am. I think he was pretty comfortably in the 40-40, but double checking here just for my own sake. Yeah, he was 41-73. So I think that, he's in the ballpark there, but at the same time, now that he has dealt with these multiple torn ACLs, I am a little bit skeptical of how much they're going to let him be such a, devastator on the base paths. You look at some of these younger stars as well, where Jackson Chourio, youngest player in NBA or in MLB history to have a 2020 season. It's a long way to go to add, a couple 30 to each of those totals. I just feel like if it happens, it'll be very exciting when it does, but I wouldn't, stay up at night waiting on that moment to take place, because this might be a once-in-a-lifetime thing. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. What an incredible moment for Ohtani and really the entire world of baseball. But we're now going to be heading into our final segment of the day, where we are going to be reacting to the news that the Philadelphia 76ers are signing superstar Joel Embiid to a 3-year max contract extension. So we'll be breaking down the details of the contract, what it means for the near future of Philadelphia, and whether or not this is going to be a deal that they ultimately come back to look fondly upon. But we're going to be diving into that. But first, a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we head into our final segment of the day. This morning, we got the news that Joel Embiid and the Philadelphia 76ers have agreed to a 3-year, $193 million max contract extension. This is a situation where he was already going to be under contract through the 2026-27 season. So, definitely a little bit premature here to some degree, but this also, the way that it fully breaks out, actually, it actually only adds an extra 2 years on top of that. It gives them a slight increase in pay in that 26-27 season. It adds on one more fully guaranteed season in 2027-28, and then a player option in 28-29. So he's going to be making in that $60 million range per year during those 3 seasons, assuming I'm assuming he will take on that player option, considering he'll be 34 years old and will have $69 million waiting for him. So I would think that that's pretty hard to pass up on, but we'll see. The reality of the situation is that Embiid, we all understand how excellent he is and how games missed are a massive part of his career up to this point, where it is definitely disappointing that we haven't gotten to see what the true peak of Embiid's powers look like when he is fully healthy in the playoffs, but we know how excellent he is. So, while I do feel like, again, this was maybe a slightly premature move from them, at the end of the day, the 76ers understand that Embiid is the best player that they've had since Allen Iverson. You could go even maybe a little bit before that as well. I don't want to dive into that whole argument there. Not something that I want to have. Probably fans on both sides of that argument mad at me to some degree. But the 76ers, I think that the biggest thing for them is just the fact that they want to have no drama coming into the season. Last year, obviously, the James Harden saga was a big-time distraction going into the year, and they quickly move off of that to be able to just sort of move around pieces, get some expiring deals, and prepare themselves for having cap space for this past offseason, which they then use to sign Paul George. And it was a signing that, I feel like more NBA fans than I was expecting were out on this idea of them signing Paul George. I think it was kind of a no-brainer move, given that, is Paul George a perfect player? No. But the reality is, how often do you get players that are caliber of All-NBA in free agency? And I do say that with Paul George. It's not that he was All-NBA last year, but for a lot of the season, he was at least in the conversation. And the 76ers aren't going to need Paul George to go out and make an All-NBA team. This is just about the idea of they need a more consistent third option because as we saw last year and we've seen for years, Tobias Harris was very clearly not that. Now you have Tyrese Maxey who's emerging, but and as much as I like Tyrese Maxey and I think that he brings a ton to the plate in terms of, shot creating ability, just his speed in the transition game is excellent. Perfect pick and roll partner with Joel Embiid. But that being said, he's not somebody that necessarily is going to be able to shoulder a massive workload with a high success rate in terms of wins and losses. And not yet, at least. And, I think that a lot of people get very defensive over Tyrese Maxey. And, I want to make it very clear that I am a big fan of Maxey. He's still just 23 years old. He has an extremely bright future ahead of him. The reality of the situation is, and not that I'm holding it against him necessarily himself because there were a lot of other flaws on the roster, but when you talk about the minutes that Tyrese Maxey played himself without Joel Embiid, both in the regular season and more specifically in the playoffs, the 76ers offense was just not good. And that is a situation that they needed to have another star to throw out there, and Paul George has definitely had his share of injury concerns as well over recent seasons, which isn't exactly a great sign considering you're throwing him with Joel Embiid, who obviously has his own issues. But I think that at this point now, PG can sort of be a third option. I would assume that's the way the pecking order is going to go here. And this idea of, Paul George, in a lot of ways, I would argue, is a lot of what Tobias Harris was, but at a higher level, where Tobias never had the shot creating ability necessarily. I mean, I can't say never. There were definitely some years early on with him that I was a very, very big fan of Tobias, but we would all agree that Paul George is significantly better with the ball in his hands, but just the idea that he can be this swing man that can take on, high-end defensive responsibilities for whatever it's worth. I thought that Tobias Harris did pretty well, all things considered, on the defensive side of the ball. Offense, obviously not. And 76ers fans were, packing his bags for him for probably a couple years, but especially after that closeout performance where he was abysmal offensively, and not even abysmal, it's just that he was invisible way too often for Philadelphia. That Paul George, he's going to make his presence felt, and I think in a positive light. Paul George sort of has this reputation with a lot of NBA fans that he's not clutch, that he can't carry an offense. Well, he's not going to be asked to in this situation. The idea is that Joel Embiid is going to be fully healthy, knock on wood there, and that they can sort of just have these other pieces that can play off of them, knock down the open shots, and just add different elements to the game. And the Big Three era feels like it's a little bit dead in the NBA, especially under the new collective bargaining agreement and how heavily teams are taxed for going over the luxury tax, that it feels like it's sort of a thing of the past. It's not often that you have this much cap space and you are able to invest it immediately into a star caliber player. And I do still think that Paul George is that, even if he's not, the emerging superstar that he was with Indiana or when he was top 3 in the MVP voting, when he was with Oklahoma City, that sure, he has his blemishes on his resume, but this is a chance where he can sort of just be refined in his own skills and not feel like he has to overcompensate for other things, because there's more than enough talent on that Philly roster between the three of them. But then also, I feel like they did a pretty good job of at least finding other talent around there. They had gotten Kelly Oubre on a vet minimum last season. Now they re-up his deal, so it's making more money, but it's still under $8 million against the cap this upcoming season. I think that he gives you very good two-way presence there, somebody who can attack the rim for you a little bit as well. I loved what they did in the draft with Jared McCain and Adem Bona, two players that it's not like you're going to be super heavily leaning on them, but I think McCain's going to come into the NBA and he's going to be a shooter. I know, whatever. Like, I'm not going to take anything out of Summer League. I know there were maybe some inconsistencies at times there, but I feel like McCain sort of relishes the idea of having the target on his back. He eats it up. Sure, he does, TikTok and everything, and he understands that it's going to come with some level of scrutiny, fair or not, but I think that he sort of internalizes it in a way where he wants to prove you wrong. And trust me, playing at college campuses in the ACC probably, heard his very fair share of chirps, and he put together an incredible freshman season. Bona is somebody where maybe a little bit on the shorter end for a big man, but I think he's going to be a very reliable defensive presence. We saw on both sides of the ball. It was when Embiid was out. I thought that they were at least going to be able to stay alive on defense while he was out with having Bamba and Paul Reed, but it clearly did not end up being the case. Bona is somebody that if they can get 10 good minutes out of him a game, I think that that's overall a pretty good sign for them. And it's not like they're an extremely deep roster, but, they have their combination of veterans. They bring in a number of, veteran names this offseason. Drummond, Reggie Jackson, Eric Gordon. They had brought in Kyle Lowry during the season last year, where overall, it's maybe slightly thin. Caleb Williams is another name that I haven't mentioned yet as well, that they have, I think, more spacing than they did last year. I think that they have a little bit more depth as well, and I think that they're going to be in the mix with everything. Now, obviously, the East at the top will be better, I believe, this season in comparison to what it was last year. The Celtics remain the Celtics, but last year it took just 50 wins to take the 2 seed, which was the Knicks, but I think that the Knicks got better. I know that, it seems like a lot of the NBA community is just out on the Bucks and that Doc Rivers isn't the guy and that they are sort of screwed long term, but I think that this is a situation. We are going into year 2 of Lillard and Giannis. I think they're going to have a better rapport this upcoming year. When you talk about a 2-man game that could break the league, they never found that last season, and injuries were part of it. Coaching was part of it as well, I think. And I think that they are going to be able to really bounce back. We saw drastic defensive improvements with that roster throughout the course of the league throughout the course of the year once they moved from Adrian Griffin to Doc Rivers. Now he has a full season with all of them. Damian Lillard, Doc revealed it. It was a little bit controversial, at least for some fans, when Doc mentioned it on the Bill Simmons podcast, that Lillard was in the worst shape of his career headed into last season because he knew a trade was imminent and he didn't want to risk getting injured. So now I would assume at least that he's coming back stronger this upcoming season. And, I think it's really the top 4 there, but even as well, you look at an Indiana who a lot of people are chalking that up to a run built off of injuries. Did injuries help them? Sure. But they're a super competitive team. You just look up and down. I think that the East is actually in better shape, specifically in that top 6, 7-ish, where you could throw the Cavaliers in there as well, pressing the reset button slightly with Kenny Atkinson, even though I do think that they are eventually going to have to make some changes with that roster, but maybe that's just me. And then the Orlando Magic, I feel like, are still maybe a bit of a ways away, but can ultimately get there as well. So I think the East is going to be a fascinating run here. I still feel like it's the Celtics' East until, somebody comes and takes it from them, but 76ers in a pretty good position headed into this season. Do I love the idea of having a 34-year-old Joel Embiid making $69 million for you? No, not really. But at the same time, if he's healthy, he's as good as anybody else in the NBA. And that's ultimately the way that the 76ers have to look at this. They understand that their championship window is probably these next 2-3 seasons. That extends a little bit further, I suppose the contract does, than when I think they'll be fully there. But, they have to sort of pour themselves into this current infrastructure and try and capitalize, because they've been knocking on the door, it feels like, in terms of regular season success for years, and are yet to even make it to a conference finals. So they are thinking that this is the offseason where they can really, rejuvenate the franchise as a whole and get themselves back on track. But, only time will tell. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. We will be back on Monday afternoon, same time as always, at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern. We will see you then. Have a great weekend. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't